YouTube and the internet. I'm Nathan Quinn, and this is episode 7, where we will discuss the cognitive first aid kit, and then we'll discuss the first injury, which is going to be moral injuries. So, just like every other video, I'm going to preface by saying I am not a medical professional. I'm not a medical provider or an expert or a healthcare provider, especially reiterating that going into this individual first aid kit, right? This is just something I came up with, and it's based largely off of just information dissemination and then shared experiences. So again, this is not like official medical advice. This is just my advice, me as a person. Okay. If you do have questions, concerns about this individual first aid kit, let's say, highly recommend and encourage you to go talk to a healthcare provider. Don't take anything I'm putting out as gospel. It is not to be used in lieu of, professional medical advice. I would always defer to the experts. Okay, again, this is just my mostly observations, and then again, just information dissemination. So the first aid kit, right? So every soldier in the Army and probably other branches, right, they get issued a first aid kit. So that at a minimum, they can treat themselves or a buddy until a medic arrives, or an actual trained professional, a medical professional. In my unit, we learned what was called Tactical Casualty Combat Care, or TCCC. And so you were given an individual first aid kit, or IFAK, or more commonly referred to as an IFAK. You were given this IFAK in order to treat along the TCCC paradigm. You were, again, issued the items. You were trained on how to use those items, primarily on yourself. Oftentimes this is something covered at basic training and then reinforced later on down the line. In Special Forces, our Special Forces medics, our 18 Deltas, are, if an individual guy carries an IFAK and is trained to treat themselves, these guys have their 18 Delta bags, and the analogy I use is these guys are like walking hospitals, basically, because they have to be prepared to, treat such a wide variety of injuries, oftentimes in austere environments where, hey, we don't have the luxury of taking this person to, a nearby higher level medical care. Like, oftentimes the medic is that higher level medical care, short of, getting that person on a flight back to, whatever safe location. So those guys were essentially, a few credit hours short of being physician's assistants. And I think that even if that is the case, that doesn't quite do them justice in terms of the things they can do. But those guys would often reinforce the training on the team. So like, hey, okay, we're going to practice, I remember one time we practiced giving each other IVs or drawing blood, so that the expectation was you as the individual had the training and the resources to do basic level things until such time as that Special Forces medic showed up. And so I started to think about, why don't we do the same thing for cognitive injuries, right? What would happen if we took, the most common cognitive injury wound sets and, or cognitive health as a concept, right? And we taught soldiers about the most basic and common wound sets and how to treat them, how to recognize them, and then treat them. So what if we started issuing these guys and gals like a cognitive IFAK, for lack of a better phrase? And again, this wouldn't necessarily be something physical so much as, the dissemination of information and, techniques, procedures, and processes to help treat these injuries until such time as they can get to a higher level of medical care. And stepping away from the military, even just using, real life, regular civilians as an example, right? You can go to the store and you can buy a first aid kit. You can buy Band-Aids, sutures, medical tape, the full gamut, right? There's websites all over the place that sell ready-made first aid kits. So what would happen if we took that same concept and made it available to everybody, right? Say, hey, okay, not just for the military, let's say, but like everybody gets access to this cognitive first aid kit. When you look at it from the perspective of a physical injury, like a cut, right? A cut by itself is not that big of a deal. Most folks can treat a cut in their house. They apply some sort of antibacterial component and then they put a Band-Aid on it. So the antibacterial stuff keeps you from getting infected, keeps you from getting worse. The Band-Aid keeps the wound clean. And then usually, if you need to replace the Band-Aid over a certain period of time, you do, and the wound usually treats itself, right? Like very infrequently will somebody need to go seek additional medical care for a cut because they were able to effectively address the cut and treat it on their own. So what if we did the same thing for cognitive injuries, right? Like what if we help people identify a cognitive cut, let's say, treat it and address it on their own so that they don't have to go see a medical provider because it got infected, because it got worse. And again, ultimately helping decrease that burden on a medical provider. This earlier on in my treatment, probably 2021, early 2022, I started working on the cognitive individual first aid kit. So I started generating some of the most common wounds that I saw, right, both personally and then through interaction with other soldiers when I did group therapy, just kind of listening to their stories, listening to their experiences. And I was like, okay, yep, that's not maybe one that I experienced, but that seems to be a reoccurring theme amongst other guys, or even just talking to team guys after the fact between leaving active duty, and starting these videos definitely reinforced that, hey, okay, these are some pretty common injuries that a lot of guys run into. So I started compiling that information. I tried to define them using, actual sources, not just me putting words to paper. I would look up usually medical websites or medical research papers and say, okay, hey, how is this organization defining this injury? And then I would apply some of the techniques that I found that worked. I would also highlight some things maybe that weren't so effective. Just to say, hey, okay, avoid doing this because it didn't work for me and it probably isn't going to work for you. It probably isn't going to work for that injury at all. So I put all that together and then I submitted it to, I ran it past my therapist, Barry, and then we sent it up to third group headquarters. And then like a year ago, 2 years ago, Barry contacted me and he said, hey, just want to let you know, like we're still working through implementing this at group. But the group CSM at the time, I can't remember who it was, but the group CSM was very interested in making it a thing. So I don't know where that is. I don't know if it's still floating around the ether somewhere at third group or if it just died on the vine. I don't know. But either way, I'm putting this information out here in this forum, so it's still accessible to people. Like anything else in the military, it takes a long time, so maybe one day third group or USASOC will adopt it and distribute that information to guys. If not, they can always come search here. If you all, as the audience, share that information, then it will still achieve the same desired end state, which is, ultimately helping people. So what's going to follow on this episode is the first injury, right? And then subsequent episodes are going to get, their own injury addressing. It is important. One thing I want to highlight is that treating a cognitive injury is unique, right? Each injury is unique because each person is unique, okay? What treatment works for one injury or one type of cognitive wound isn't necessarily going to be applicable to another one. Similarly, right, if you have two different people and they both have the same injury, right, like both people have depression, you won't necessarily be able to apply the same treatment techniques to both of them, right? Maybe you can, but that's not a hard and fast rule, right? Whereas, if you say, hey, given a fracture of a bone, you limit movement for typically a certain period of time, and do these rehab things, and usually the wound will heal itself, right? And you could apply that treatment methodology across the spectrum. So it doesn't matter whose broken leg you're treating, it's going to be the same, generally speaking, throughout the process. The treatment of a cognitive injury does not work the same way because we're all different, right? Each person is different, and each wound varies in terms of severity, and also in terms of what started it, what caused it. So I'm saying that to say when I illustrate or articulate the some of the treatment options that I used or some of the techniques that I employed, again, I'm not a medical professional. These are not gospel. These are just options that you can try to, maybe help treat that cut so that, hey, I don't need to go to the hospital now because I treated this cut. Or maybe I treat the cut and, hey, okay, I'm not afraid to go get a hospital later to go get it looked at because I want to make sure I treated it properly and go, make sure it didn't get infected, but it's not for certain infected, or, something worse has happened where the injury got worse. So just remember that when you're treating a cognitive injury, it takes time and patience. That is something that I really struggled with because I'm not a patient person. I really don't like waiting, especially for things that I can't control, right? For me, I was very end state oriented, right? Hey, identify the problem, identify the ways to fix it, execute whatever you needed to execute to fix the problem, right? Cognitive injury treatment doesn't work that way, right? There is no, all right, hey, I've identified the problem, I've identified the wound, and one of the things I learned was that, like, the harder I tried to fix the problem, like, I was so dedicated to treating my injuries. I was like, hey, I need to do this. I got to do this. Like, what I didn't realize was that I was giving these injuries attention and energy and life. By focusing on them, I was keeping them alive, right? So it's an interesting dynamic, because one of the things that I'll talk about when we get into intrusive thoughts, which is going to be next episode, that because they're going to get their own episode. I think they need their own episode. That was one of the things I really struggled with, was that, I just don't want to think about this. I just wish I could forget about it, right? Well, that is the ultimate goal, but I think it's the why behind not thinking about it, right? You don't want to actively not think about something, right? Because the more you deliberately try not to think about something, or try not to focus on or worry about a thing, the more you're going to do it, versus just passively not worrying about it, choosing instead to focus on something else in lieu of that thing, right? The end state is still going to be like, hey, okay, I'm not really worried about this anymore. I'm not thinking about this. It is not at the forefront of my concern, right? That was still the same. The difference, though, was how I got there and why I got there. And I didn't really appreciate or realize that until I got there, because, I tried the first way, like, hey, I'm forcing this thing. I want to not think about this, right? So I'm thinking about not thinking about it, if that makes sense, which of course then means you're thinking about it. So the harder I worked on trying to fix these injuries, the more they stuck around, and it was just very frustrating for me. I was like, why is this taking so long, right? Like, I'm doing the thing, I'm doing the reps, I'm making sure, I'm taking notes, what's the deal? And then a couple of months after beginning my therapy, like, my therapist was like, hey, maybe by making this such a big deal to you, like, you are putting that on a pedestal. Like, you are hyper focused on fixing this thing, that by being so hyper focused, you are making it stick around instead of just kind of letting it happen. We're like, hey, you have the techniques, you have the procedures in place. If the injury manifests, if it flares up, you know what to do. And then when it's done, you just go about your business. It's kind of passive acceptance. I'm like, yep, there it is. There's a thing. I'm going to move on with my life. And again, I'll get more into that when we get into intrusive thoughts specifically, because that really, I think, applies to those mostly. So the first thing we're going to cover is moral injuries, right? And so the first definition I have is from the National Library of Medicine, right? I'm going to put the definition up there. I'm not going to read it to you guys. But again, I tried to look up definitions for things from vetted medical sources, so that, again, it's not just me trying to put this in layman terms or Nate Quinn terms. There was one other definition I found from University of Syracuse, or Syracuse University, where it was the Moral Injury Project, right? And this is what they defined a moral injury as. So you can read those definitions, and while you're reading it, just think about how, again, from the military perspective, because that was my experience, right? I have noticed, after 20 years of fighting the global war on terror, a lot of guys, I think, identified a moral injury, or maybe several moral injuries that occurred during their time in service. I would imagine that there's some guys out there who are dealing with some injuries that maybe don't understand or realize, like, hey, the catalyst for the way I'm feeling right now, or the things that are going through my head, is this moral injury, right? And they just don't know how to identify it or how to name it. That doesn't mean that only military personnel experience moral injuries, because that's not the case. I didn't, right? Like, yes, I was in the military. Yes, I experienced moral injury, but the moral injury that I experienced or that I discovered had nothing to do with my military service. Similarly, like, moral injuries don't necessarily have to be related to combat or violence, right? There can be other things. Mine wasn't. So anybody can experience a moral injury. I'm just highlighting that, if you are a, GWAT vet and you're feeling some kind of way about some things, maybe explore, like, hey, was there something underneath all this that maybe I didn't really identify before? Because it could be, right? Again, like, this had been with me. I didn't discover it until I was 30. But it was something that happened when I was way younger than that. Like, teens, preteens, somewhere in there. It happened so long ago, I don't really remember how old I was. But it had been with me all that time. It was just not ever really anything I paid attention to until, when I was 30, peeling back the layers of everything wrong I'd ever done. Oh, there it is. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a recent thing. It could, more likely than not, it wasn't a recent thing. I was revisiting and reviving my past mistakes, and I looked at this mistake I made when I was pre-teens, and it was just incompatible with who I was and my ethics or my morals, or just who I saw myself as a 30-year-old. Just could not reconcile that. It just was frustrating for me, because, like, this is not anything I can go back and change. I can't undo this, but, like, this is not, me as a 30-year-old. Like, I don't want to be that person. Like, I don't want to have done that. Like, that is not who I am. That's not what I want to be. And it was, how do they phrase it? It was, just the polar opposite of who you are, right? Goes against your very morals as a person. It wasn't really a healthy response to that injury, because I started judging myself, my much younger self, as an adult, right? I was applying the same expectations that I applied to myself as a 30-year-old to myself as a 12 or 13-year-old. And, that's not fair to myself. I wouldn't do it to my kids, right? If my kids were 12 or 13, it's not fair of me to expect them to compose themselves as a 30-year-old, or as anything but a 12 and 13-year-old. And it's not healthy, because, like, you can't undo that. You can't go back and fix it. So this continued to really just chew and degrade my self-esteem and my self-confidence because, again, this inability to fix the problem, there was no fixing it, right? You can't go back and undo it. But it just was just like vehemently not in line with who I was as a person. So I began to see myself as a bad person. Like, oh, this thing happened. I did this thing. I must be a bad person. I'm a terrible human being. And months of this, of me sitting with it internally, slowly just started degrading my confidence. And, that I think that is what gradually led to depression. And again, I didn't realize it at the time that like, hey, okay, this is a moral injury and it's turning into depression. Like I didn't know any of this stuff. But after so long of basically beating yourself down and feeling like a piece of crap, like what other recourse is there other than to feel depressed? Like, well, this is depressing. Like I feel like shit. I don't want to feel like shit all the time. The interesting thing was when, I had convinced myself so much because of this that I was such a bad person that when I told my wife, my parents, my therapist, and some of my closest friends, and they were all like, yeah, you kind of blew that out of proportion. You definitely judged yourself a little too harshly. Like the injury in and of itself, the event really was not that big of a deal as you made it out to be in your head. Again, just reiterating that we are often harder on ourselves than we are on other people. And they also highlighted that, hey, whoever that person was, even though like it's not that big of a deal, right? But let's say for argument's sake it was, you are not that person now. Like who you are now is not that person then. And so holding yourself to the same standard and then that you hold yourself now is just going to drive yourself insane. And it was. So not a very realistic thing. And honestly, it's impossible. I was setting myself up for failure. I couldn't go back in the past and fix that or undo it. And so you're just, you're setting yourself up to just drive yourself up a wall. And, there really is no other recourse other than to enter a state of depression and or anxiety, because this inability to accept that this happened, but that doesn't mean you're a bad person. So the turning point for that injury for me was getting that external feedback, right? Because like if I kept it internal in my head, I just had this like feedback loop where like I did this thing, I don't like that I did this thing, I can't undo it, I'm just a piece of shit. I don't want to be a piece of shit. Wash, rinse, repeat, right? And so it just created the cycle where over a period of time, it just degraded myself down. But once I got that external feedback, somebody external outside of my mind and, maybe an unbiased opinion or a third party, like, hey, one, that's not that big of a deal. Two, dude, it's okay. Like shit happens. We all screw up. You were a kid, like not the end of the world. Just let it go. Like it's fine. So that having that sounding board was really, I think, the critical part of the treatment, because it was knowing, okay, well, of course I'm telling myself that because I just don't want to be a bad person. Like, of course you would tell yourself it's not that big of a deal. Like, no, you have multiple other external people telling you like, hey, it's not that big of a deal. It's okay. So, for my recommendations for how to, or at least how I worked through my moral injury, the first thing I want to highlight was like, do not isolate yourself. Do not internalize it. That is, if you do nothing else, like don't do that. Locate somebody that you trust. Not just that you trust, like, hey, okay, you're going to keep this between me and you, but also like, hey, I trust your judgment. I trust your input and I value your input. Like you are a person who I think aligns with who I am as a person, right? Like we share values. I want to get your input on this. I want to get your feedback. Also hoping that you keep this on the down low. So don't just sit in a room in your head by yourself and just, perseverate on this. That is not going to lead you to a good place. Another thing that helped me work through this was realizing, like, we've all made mistakes. Every single person on this planet has made a mistake. I was so focused on, the bad things that I had done, because once I uncovered this moral injury, I started looking at all these other, like, what are all these bad things that I've done throughout my life? And so, like, just focusing on the negative things, the mistakes that I had made in my life over 30 some odd years as a human being on this planet. And I completely ignored or discounted the good things, the positive impacts that I had had on the planet. And so, the net result being like, oh, okay, I'm just a bad person because I'm so fixated on all the negative things and the bad things that I've done, not taking into account the reality that, like, okay, yes, you did do these things, that did happen. However, these are all, like, over the course of your life, if you had to break it up into a percentage, like, that accounts for a very small percent of the actions and the things that you've taken versus the other percent that either was just neutral or positive. Again, going back to that Western way of thinking, like, things don't necessarily have to be this is good or bad. Like, there can just be net neutral actions, like, hey, this didn't hurt anybody, didn't help anybody, it just was. Like, you woke up this morning, that's not necessarily positive or a negative, or maybe it is for you. If you, like, hey, I'm great, my grandpa loves it, like, hey, I woke up another day, that's a good thing, I'm still alive, like, great. Maybe that's not your perception, and that's okay. The thing that really helped me, I think, I forget who it was who told me, I think it was my therapist, but he told me, good people can make bad decisions. And that one just really kind of stuck with me. And I was like, okay, good people can make bad decisions. And that doesn't mean they're bad people. They're still a good person, but they can make mistakes, or they can do bad things from time to time. And so that helped me realize, like, hey, we are not our mistakes. We are who we are. The mistakes, the things that we do, mistakes in question, those are something that we did. That is not who we are as a person. And that really, I think, helped me get over that hurdle. And again, that came from an external source. That was not me telling myself that came from my therapist. And so again, I think that's another benefit to looking outside of yourself for help, is because some people might have a really awesome perspective that, like, hey, you know what, I never considered that, or I never thought about that. Like, that's a good point. And so soliciting multiple perspectives is only going to help you. Sitting inside your head where, you're beating yourself up over something, like, okay, well, we already know what I think about this because I'm beating myself up over it. I don't need to solicit more of that. One of the things he told me was, try not to judge myself today based off of things I did way back when, right? Don't use my current, moral compass or current standards against myself back then, because it's not fair. And it's obviously not going to work out in your favor. One of the things that, not everybody's religious, and that's okay, but if you are, maybe consider going to confession and talking to your priest about it. Again, seek that external feedback and, like, unburden yourself. Show yourself some compassion. You're like, hey, you know what? Yeah, I screwed up. That was not a great thing. Maybe it was just, not that big of a deal, but, like, be compassionate with yourself. Like, hey, I am a human being. I am allowed to and even expected to be imperfect and make mistakes, and that's okay. Spoiler alert, everybody is. For whatever reason, the moral injuries, like a lot of the cognitive injuries, I think they are most potent or painful or severe if they are retained internally, if that makes sense. it's kind of like it thrives in the darkness, right? Like a lot of, like, I think depression and anxiety, a lot of cognitive injuries thrive in darkness, right? They love cold, dark, damp places. If you bring it out into the open, into the light, you share it with people, you literally and figuratively shine a light on it, like, it kind of shrivels up. It's kind of like a weed, right? Don't let it sit in the darkness of your mind by yourself. Like, shine some light on it, let other people in, show it to other people, and you might be surprised about the feedback that you get. I found that, again, the moral injury, like a lot of my cognitive injuries, like, the more I opened up to folks about it, the less severe it became, the less I worried about it. And I think, going back to like episode 3, 4, 5, somewhere in there, I think a lot of that goes back to shame. And again, specific to the moral injury, right? It is something that is, morally incompatible or ethically incompatible with who you are as a person. And you are probably ashamed of that because, like, hey, I do not like that I did this thing, or I do not like that I didn't do this thing that I should have done. I am ashamed of that. And so by letting go of that shame through sharing this injury with somebody else, I feel like that significantly decreases, if not outright removes, the shame associated with that moral injury. And I feel like once you get rid of that shame of it, that allows you then to be at peace with the fact that, like, yes, this thing happened, but no, it does not make you a bad person. It is not who you are as an individual. It's just something that happened right alongside all the other things that have happened in the however many years of your life. So that's the beginning of the individual first aid kit, the cognitive individual first aid kit, and we covered moral injuries. Next episode, we're going to cover intrusive thoughts. That one was a doozy. So if you liked this episode, if you have other techniques maybe that you have applied for moral injuries, or that you've seen or heard other people apply for moral injuries, please share them down below in the comments. Really appreciate your time and continue to watching these videos. And until the next one, I'll see you guys then.